When a preacher and a mafia boss share a secret, it isn't just a scandal, it's a ticking time bomb. One slip, one wrong move, and the fallout could be deadly. But when the preacher's wife got too close to the truth, she didn't just uncover a betrayal. She signed her own death warrant. Pastor Elijah Warren was a man of faith, a guiding voice to his congregation, and a devoted husband. Malcolm King was a feared mafia boss, a man who controlled everything, except his own desires. What started as mentorship became something far more personal, far more dangerous. Their affair was a secret that could never be exposed. But Naomi Warren, Elijah's wife, saw the signs. The late-night meetings, the secret phone calls, the way her husband seemed to slip further and further away. At first, she ignored the whispers in her mind, convincing herself it was nothing. But once she started putting the pieces together, there was no turning back. And before she could reveal what she knew, she was silenced. Welcome to Everyday True Crime, where we uncover the darkest, most shocking cases that seem too twisted to be real. If you're drawn to the secrets people kill to protect, subscribe now, because some stories don't just shock you. They haunt you. Pastor Elijah Warren had always been a man of purpose. From the moment he felt called to ministry, he dedicated his life to guiding others, offering them light in their darkest moments. His church, New Hope Baptist, stood as a beacon in the heart of the city, a place where the lost could find salvation, where sinners could find redemption. And among those seeking redemption was Malcolm King. Malcolm was everything Elijah wasn't, ruthless, feared, and steeped in a kind of power that didn't come from faith, but from fear. He ran the city's underground with an iron fist, controlling everything from illicit businesses to the very people who dared to stand in his way. But for all his power, Malcolm had demons, burdens he carried that no amount of money, muscle, or murder could erase. He had grown up in violence, learned to fight before he learned to pray, and somewhere along the way, he had lost a part of himself. He didn't believe in salvation, but he wanted something, peace, clarity, maybe even forgiveness. And that was how he found himself at Elijah's church one evening, slipping into the back pew like a shadow that didn't belong. At first, their interactions were brief. Malcolm lingered after service, listening but never speaking. Elijah, observant as always, noticed him but didn't push. It wasn't until Malcolm approached him after a sermon on redemption that their bond truly began. "I don't think there's a way back for someone like me," Malcolm admitted, his voice low, guarded. Elijah had seen men like him before, hardened, broken, convinced they were beyond saving. He offered him what he offered everyone, understanding. "No one is beyond grace," he replied. "But you have to want it." That conversation turned into another, and another. Late-night phone calls, private meetings in Elijah's office. At first, it was all about faith. Malcolm confided in Elijah, revealing pieces of himself that no one else saw. The sins he regretted. The choices he wished he could take back. And Elijah, bound by his calling, listened. Guided him. Helped him navigate the weight of the life he had built. But somewhere along the way, the lines blurred. Malcolm had always been drawn to power, and Elijah possessed a different kind of strength, one that didn't come from violence or intimidation. It fascinated him, intrigued him, and before he even realized it, he was craving more than just Elijah's advice. He wanted his presence. His approval. And when Elijah found himself anticipating their meetings just as much, he knew something was shifting. At first, it was unspoken, lingering glances, conversations that stretched past midnight, moments where silence held more weight than words. But then, one night, something changed. Malcolm had shown up unannounced, restless, carrying the kind of energy that came before a storm. "I did something I can't take back," he said, his voice heavy with something that sounded like regret. Elijah knew better than to ask for details. Instead, he simply offered him the solace of prayer. He reached for Malcolm's hands, bowing his head, whispering words of forgiveness on his behalf. But when he looked up, Malcolm's eyes weren't filled with guilt anymore. They were filled with something else. Elijah should have pulled away. He should have reminded Malcolm of the life he had, the wife waiting for him at home, the congregation that looked up to him. But in that moment, none of it mattered. The first touch was hesitant. A test. The second was deliberate. And by the time their lips met, their fate had already been sealed. What started as an innocent mission, a preacher guiding a lost man, had become something neither of them could walk away from. Their affair was electric, reckless, and all-consuming. In public, they were still the pastor and the reformed sinner. In private, they were something far more dangerous. And for a while, they thought they could keep it hidden. But secrets have a way of unraveling. And when Elijah's wife, Naomi, started noticing the way her husband and Malcolm looked at each other, she knew. Naomi Warren had always been proud of her marriage to Elijah. They were a team, partners in faith, partners in life. Elijah had been a pillar of strength for her ever since they first met. He was the charismatic pastor, the man who could inspire a room full of people with his words. He was a man of faith, a man who promised to love her forever, and, in return, she loved him with everything she had. Their life together had been stable, grounded in mutual respect, and unwavering devotion. Naomi believed in the sanctity of their vows, for better or worse, was more than just a phrase to her, it was a promise they'd both made. But as time passed, something started to shift. At first, it was small things. Elijah coming home late from church meetings more frequently, acting distracted when they were together, his once bright eyes now clouded with something Naomi couldn't put her finger on. His focus seemed to drift, toward his work, his church, and especially toward one particular member of the congregation, Malcolm King. At first, she thought little of it. Malcolm was just another troubled soul seeking guidance. Elijah had always been willing to help anyone who needed it, especially those who were struggling with their past, like Malcolm, a man wrapped up in dangerous dealings with the city's underworld. But then, Naomi began to notice patterns she couldn't ignore. Elijah and Malcolm were spending more and more time together, meeting in private, taking phone calls in the middle of the night, talking in whispers when Naomi was nearby. Their conversations seemed to carry an undertone of secrecy, and Elijah's behavior became increasingly erratic. He was distant at home, his mind clearly elsewhere. His late-night phone calls became more frequent, and he would often rush off at odd hours with vague explanations about meetings, church business, or urgent matters that needed his attention. It was subtle at first. Elijah was always so careful with his words, so practiced in keeping his private life guarded. But Naomi wasn't blind. The little things began to build up, a lingering touch when they spoke, a nervous glance when she asked where he was going, a certain tension in the air when Malcolm visited the house. Naomi had always trusted Elijah, but now doubt began to seep in. Was she imagining things? Or was there something more going on between her husband and Malcolm? One night, when Elijah was particularly distant, Naomi found herself staring at the phone on the kitchen counter. It had buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Elijah had quickly picked it up and stepped out of the room, leaving it behind. Naomi knew it wasn't like him to ignore his phone, especially not when they were home together. She picked it up, debating whether or not to look through it. After all, trust was the foundation of their relationship, wasn't it? But the gnawing suspicion in her gut told her she needed to know the truth. With a trembling hand, Naomi unlocked the phone. The first message she saw wasn't a name but a string of cryptic phrases that made no sense. Meet at 10 o'clock. We can't wait much longer. Everything is at stake. It was followed by a second message, don't let anyone find out. We have to be careful. The messages weren't explicit, but the tone, so secretive, so urgent, struck a chord deep within Naomi. Her heart raced. She flipped through a few more messages, each one increasing her sense of dread. There were no direct confessions, no promises, but the hidden language between Elijah and Malcolm was enough to send a chill down Naomi's spine. She had never seen Elijah communicate like this with anyone before. And in that moment, everything she thought she knew about her marriage started to feel like a lie. Desperate for answers, Naomi began to follow Elijah in secret. At first, it was just a gut feeling, a hunch that something was wrong. So, she began watching him more closely, tracking his movements when he was away. One evening, Elijah slipped out of the house again, leaving Naomi with nothing but her suspicions and a growing unease. She followed him quietly, driving behind him as he made his way toward a part of town she didn't recognize. Her pulse quickened when she saw him pull into a hotel parking lot, the same one she had passed a few times on her way to the store. Elijah parked the car and walked into the hotel without a second glance. Naomi waited in her car, heart pounding in her chest. Her mind raced. What was he doing here? Why was he at this hotel, at this hour? She waited for what felt like an eternity, watching through the rearview mirror, trying to make sense of the growing pit in her stomach. Finally, she saw Elijah emerge from the hotel, but he wasn't alone. Malcolm King walked beside him, their heads close, their voices low. They were laughing, talking like old friends, like confidants. It was a sight that twisted something deep inside Naomi. She had always known that Elijah had a certain bond with Malcolm, but seeing them like this, so intimate, so comfortable, shattered something inside her. It was more than just friendship. She could see the way they moved together, the way they shared glances that lingered too long. This was more than just spiritual guidance. This was something deeper. But even then, Naomi still didn't have the proof she needed. She hadn't seen anything explicit, no physical signs that would confirm her worst fears. But in her heart, she knew what was happening between them. The betrayal was undeniable. Naomi paced back and forth in the dimly lit living room, her mind racing, her chest tightening with every second that passed. The moment Elijah stepped through the door, she felt an uncontrollable surge of emotion take over her body. She had held in her suspicions for too long, had swallowed her doubts and fears in silence, but tonight, everything was coming to the surface. Her voice was shaking, but she refused to hold back. "Where were you?" she asked, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. Elijah set down his keys and took a deep breath, already sensing that something was wrong. "Naomi, I told you, I had a meeting." "A meeting?" She let out a bitter laugh. "A meeting at a hotel, Elijah?" Elijah froze. His heartbeat thundered in his chest. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Naomi's eyes filled with tears as she took a step closer. "I followed you, Elijah. I saw you." His silence confirmed everything. She didn't need to see a text message or hear him confess. His hesitation, the look in his eyes, the fear written across his face told her the truth. "How long?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "How long have you been lying to me?" Elijah swallowed hard, his mind scrambling for something to say, some way to undo what had already unraveled. "Naomi, I can explain." "Explain what?" she snapped, her anger rising. "Explain why the man I vowed to spend my life with has been sneaking around with Malcolm King. Explain why you've been lying to me for God knows how long." She shook her head, her voice trembling with pain. "I gave you everything, Elijah. I stood by your side while you built this church, while you became the man everyone admired. And now I find out that it was all a lie." Elijah reached for her, but she pulled away. "Naomi, please, you don't understand." "Then make me understand," she shouted, tears streaming down her face. "Make me understand how you could betray me like this. Make me understand why my husband, the man who preaches about honesty and faithfulness, is sneaking off to hotels with a Mafia lord." Elijah ran a hand over his face, his mind in chaos. He knew there was no way out of this. Naomi wasn't going to let this go. And then, her voice turned sharp. "I'm not staying quiet about this, Elijah." He looked up at her, his stomach twisting. I won't be the obedient wife who looks the other way while her husband lives a double life, she continued, her voice shaking with rage. People deserve to know the truth. Panic surged through Elijah's veins. Naomi, no, he said quickly. You can't. I can and I will, she shot back. You've lied to me, to the church, to everyone. I refuse to be a part of this sick game. Elijah's world spun as he realized just how quickly everything was spiraling out of control. He had spent years building his reputation, his church, his entire life on a foundation of trust and respect. If Naomi spoke out, it would all come crashing down. The congregation would turn on him. The church board would strip him of his title. The life he had built would be ruined. Naomi refused to be silent. She had made that clear the night she confronted Elijah. She had cried, screamed, and made a vow, she would not be the wife who turned a blind eye. Elijah had spent the last few days trying to calm her down, to make her see reason. He begged, pleaded, swore that they could work through it, that this didn't have to destroy their lives. But the more he spoke, the more Naomi pulled away. She wanted out of the marriage, out of the lies, out of the web of secrets that Elijah had spun. And Malcolm knew it. Elijah had turned to Malcolm for advice, hoping his powerful friend would find a way to keep Naomi quiet. He had underestimated just how far Malcolm would go to protect their secret. Naomi never saw it coming. It happened fast. One evening, after she left her sister's house, she never made it home. A dark car followed her for miles before forcing her off the road. Two men dragged her from the driver's seat, her screams swallowed by the night. She fought, but she was no match for them. The next morning, her body was found in an abandoned lot on the outskirts of town. The scene was brutal, her face beaten, her wrists bound. The autopsy later revealed she had been strangled. It wasn't just a murder. It was a message. Elijah was shattered. When he got the news, the breath was stolen from his lungs. He collapsed in his office, gripping his desk as if the weight of his grief would crush him. He knew. Even before Malcolm said the words, Elijah knew exactly who was responsible. Elijah Warren had spent his life preaching about redemption, about how no soul was beyond saving. But standing face to face with Malcolm King, he realized something chilling: there were some people who didn't want to be saved. After Naomi's murder, Elijah had barely been able to breathe. Grief and guilt crushed him, but underneath it all, something else had begun to rise: rage. He had spent the past few days in a haze, unable to think, unable to pray. The love of his life was gone, and he knew exactly who had stolen her from him. He stormed into Malcolm's penthouse, his entire body trembling with fury. The place was as lavish as ever, crystal decanters filled with expensive liquor, gold-trimmed furniture that spoke of a life built on crime and blood. Malcolm sat behind his desk, calm as ever, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hand. "You killed her," Elijah spat, his voice thick with grief. Malcolm didn't even blink. "I protected us." "Protected?" Elijah's hands clenched into fists. "She was my wife. She was a liability." Malcolm sighed, setting his glass down. "I did what needed to be done." The sheer coldness in his voice made Elijah's stomach turn. There was no remorse. No regret. Naomi's life had meant nothing to him, just another obstacle to be removed. Something inside Elijah snapped. "I'm going to the police," he said. The words felt like fire in his throat, but they were the only thing that made sense now. "I'm going to tell them everything. About Naomi. About you. About us." Malcolm's eyes darkened. He leaned back in his chair, studying Elijah as if deciding whether or not he was serious. "Think carefully about what you're saying," Malcolm said, his voice low and warning. "Because once you open that door, there's no closing it." Elijah shook his head. "I don't care anymore. You crossed a line, Malcolm. You murdered my wife. His voice cracked, but he forced himself to keep going. I won't let you get away with this. Malcolm exhaled slowly, then reached into the drawer of his desk. Elijah didn't even have time to react. The gunshot echoed through the penthouse, sharp and final. Malcolm stood over him now, gun still raised, his expression unreadable. You should have stayed quiet, he murmured. Elijah's body jerked violently as the bullet tore into his chest. His breath hitched, his mouth opening in a silent gasp of shock. Stumbling back, his hands instinctively clutched at the wound, crimson seeping between his fingers. He looked at Malcolm with wide, disbelieving eyes, as if trying to comprehend the betrayal that had just taken his life. His legs gave out, and he crumpled to the floor, a weak, choking sound escaping his lips as he tried, and failed, to breathe. His body twitched once, then stilled. Malcolm exhaled slowly, lowering the gun. There was no panic, no hesitation, just cold calculation. Elijah had made his choice. And Malcolm had made his. Without missing a beat, he turned to the two men standing silently by the door, his most trusted enforcers. They had been there the night Naomi Warren was taken care of. They would handle this, too. Get rid of it, Malcolm ordered, his voice even, as if he were giving instructions on a business deal. The men nodded without question. They had done this before. As they moved to lift Elijah's body, Malcolm took a final look at the man who had once been his deepest secret, his forbidden indulgence. There was no time for sentiment. He had to move. Within minutes, Malcolm was in the back of a black SUV, the city lights blurring past as they raced toward the private airstrip on the outskirts of town. His exit had been planned long before tonight, an emergency escape route he had prepared in case things ever went south. And now, that plan was in motion. By the time Elijah's body was stuffed into a shallow ditch on the outskirts of the city, covered hastily with dirt and debris, Malcolm was already boarding a private jet. The engines roared to life as he settled into his seat, expression unreadable. His passport was fake. His identity? Already erased. Within hours, he would be on foreign soil, untouchable. Back in the city, Elijah's disappearance didn't raise alarms immediately. The preacher had been distant, withdrawn since Naomi's murder. It wasn't unusual for him to go off the grid. But days later, a jogger stumbled upon something half buried in an abandoned lot. At first, it looked like trash. But then, the smell hit. And when they saw the pale, lifeless hand stick. It didn't take long for authorities to confirm what they had found, the decomposing body of Pastor Elijah Warren, a single gunshot wound to the chest. The murder shocked the community. 2 deaths, so close together, both tied to the same man. But the man responsible? Gone without a trace. By the time law enforcement pieced it all together, Malcolm King had vanished into thin air. Some secrets are too dangerous to keep. Some betrayals leave wounds that can never heal. And when the truth is buried under layers of deception, the cost of keeping it hidden can be deadly. Elijah Warren thought he could live 2 lives, one as a devoted husband and preacher, the other entangled in a dangerous affair with a man who knew no limits. But secrets have a way of unraveling, and when his wife saw too much, the life he built came crashing down. In the end, the truth he tried so hard to hide didn't just ruin him, it destroyed everything. His marriage. His faith. His life. Lies can break a home, but some secrets. They don't just ruin lives. They end them. If this case left you speechless, there's more where that came from. Subscribe to Everyday True Crime for more shocking, real-life cases that prove the scariest stories aren't just fiction. Because sometimes, the truth is more terrifying than anything you could imagine.